Hello, I'm Anne Russell and I'm continuing reading my book, Alcohol and Pregnancy, My Responsible Disturbance. This is chapter 11, Hindsight is a Wonderful Thing. It's quite a large chapter, so I might break it up into a couple of videos. So when Mick was just over 3 years old, Seth was conceived. Pregnancy seemed so natural to me. I took a test and 2 days later, another one. Both were positive. I was happy, but really scared. What if our next baby suffered from colic and the other problems that Mick had been through? I was frightened yet excited by the prospect of having a brother or sister for Mick and another child for our family. Now that I had my own growing family, it was clear to me how unwell my mother was. How could a mother not love her child? It just didn't seem possible. I would die 1,000 deaths for my children, yet time and time again, even when I was young, my mother made sure I knew that her life would have been so much better had I not been born. My pregnancy progressed. I had no illnesses and no symptoms at all until the third trimester, when I noticed that my baby hadn't moved for several hours. I'd been drinking, but I still didn't know it was harmful, so I didn't think to mention it to my doctor. Not one medical person told me that alcohol was bad, nor did they screen me for substance use or abuse. I'm being completely honest when I say this. I never, at any stage of my pregnancy or my children's lives until 2000, did I ever think that alcohol was bad. I mostly drank while cooking the evening meal and then perhaps another with dinner. I never considered that I was an alcoholic or even an incipient alcoholic at that stage in my life. In fact, I actually don't think I was. I think it was only later. When I was in Scotland during my early travels overseas, I remember seeing a man drinking from a bottle wrapped in a brown paper bag. He was dishevelled and smelled of alcohol and other body odour. And he looked as if he had not bathed for weeks. His hair was matted, parts were caked in what I hoped was mud. I didn't know whether he had any place to live, but when he came towards me, I stood my ground, not wanting to appear disrespectful or afraid. He mumbled and held his hand out. I assumed he was asking for money for food, so I gave him £1. £1 then might have been around $10 now. I followed him after I gave him the money and saw him head straight for the nearest pub. I knew then that he was an alcoholic. From that moment onwards, my impression of an alcoholic was someone who was homeless, smelly, dirty and male. For me to see myself as an alcoholic then would have required a complete reversal of my understanding of the nature of this disease. So when my baby stopped moving, I didn't think that my drinking had been responsible. I drove to a little country town called Emerald, which was almost an hour away from where we lived, to see my doctor. He advised me to stay in town and monitor the movements of my baby. If there was no activity by the end of the day, I was to be admitted to hospital for observation. With the rest and relaxation in the hospital, and as I suspect now, a couple of days with no alcohol, my baby started to move again. I don't remember how much I drank during this pregnancy, but I do remember mixing milk and rum during the winter months. I have a sense that I may have consumed 2 to 4 drinks 2 or 3 times a week. There would have been many days I didn't drink. Seth was born by caesarean section and appeared to be a healthy baby with normal reflexes and responses. Even though I had a caesarean with Mick, this one was very different. It was an experience I would never want to repeat. If I had any doubts that my baby was to be, or this baby was to be my last, what occurred with Seth's birth made sure of it. In those days, a general anaesthetic was normal for a Caesar. It was only much later that epidurals became the usual anaesthetic for caesarean births. I was prepped for surgery and wheeled into the operating theatre. However, this is where the normal part of the operation ended and the abnormal part began. I woke up. I knew where I was and what was happening around me. I was lying flat on my back and saw the surgeon share a little joke under the bright surgery lights. I knew this wasn't right because I woke up as they were shoving a tube down my throat. That in itself was a terrible experience. I tried to move to show them that I was still awake and that I could feel the tube as they pushed it down, but I couldn't make even the smallest movement. The two doctors finished their joke. Then as one began their work, I imagined that the anaesthesiologist had given them the nod, that he thought I was under sufficiently for them to begin, but he was wrong. I felt the first incision in its entirety. It felt like nothing I can describe because there had been nothing like it in my life to compare. It was hot. The cut felt quite hot, but it was almost like it wasn't there because there was nothing I could do. If I'd been able to move or talk, I would have been screaming. I tried to move my arms, my fingers, anything to let them know that I wasn't completely under. I tried screaming, but I couldn't make a sound and they kept cutting. Then they cut again. I felt them spread the wound and then a horrible pulling sensation and then I passed out. Even as I'm reading it, I can remember that vividly. It's not one of those things that, unfortunately, that I'd forgotten. I'm not sure this part was real, but I think I saw my baby before I passed out. All of this probably only lasted a minute or two, but those, well, might have been longer, but those minutes were very painful. Although Seth's birth was traumatic for me, thankfully it wasn't so for him. He was a joy to feed and he thrived. He raced through his infancy and he walked at 9 months. He only had 2 speeds, full throttle and asleep. When he was awake, he was in a constant motion, moving, examining, testing and discovering. When he was tired, he slept where he dropped. I have photographs of him asleep on his truck, on a table, on toys, on the dog. He went to sleep in the dentist and once in a plate of spaghetti. Towards the end of his 3rd year, his behaviour began to include the most amazing meltdowns. They defied logic and lasted for hours if he didn't get what he wanted right there and then. He would scream, yell and fling himself at walls. He'd run at a wall and punch it with his little fists, crying and screaming at me. When we visited doctors, he would run around the room. When we visited friends, he urged Mick on, so they were both completely out of control. I just couldn't go anywhere. I stopped visiting friends and even family. I just could not take them anywhere. They would destroy everything. While Mick was sick almost constantly when he was little, Seth was rarely so and thrived well. He did develop severe eczema on his feet, which only very slightly reduced his mobility. But otherwise, he was a healthy boy. That eczema was really bad, though. Oh, it was terrible. God. Getting both boys to sleep at night was a time of complete exasperation for me. Don was on shift roster and more often than not would be at work. Seth's behaviour served as the catalyst to antagonise and provoke Mick, and between the two of them, the time between going to bed and going to sleep was absolutely a nightmare for me. Probably for them too. To give them opportunities for play with the idea of tiring them out, I built a tree house. By the time we left Greenvale, the backyard was a climbing, reaching, playing, building, screaming, messy, crazy place where all the kids in the neighbourhood came to play. It was my only option for socialisation for them because Seth was not welcome anywhere. While it was great for my boys, it turned me into a crazy person who had regular headaches. Oh, yes, I can remember there was like a tight band around my head. It was terrible. It was my only, oh yeah, I've read that. These days I can't take as much stress. I think it's all related to consistent high levels of stress and anxiety over the years. Actually, that's another thing I should mention to parents, unless I've mentioned it here, but no, is those chronic stress can cause a lot of health problems. And any parent of a child with FASD is going to be under chronic stress. So please take time out to look after yourselves because it can cause a lot of damage to your body. That chronic, ongoing, daily stress. of trying to manage a child with FASD. Seth would almost always be found on the outer edges of every group, rarely close to anyone. He would try to join in a play group, or a group play rather, but he would be shoved aside again and again. My heart broke as I imagined the pain of rejection he was feeling. The images in my mind still hurt me physically. Though he rarely said anything, I was sure he knew he was being excluded, although I think I felt that rejection more deeply than he did. I often believed I was the only person in the world who knew what was in his heart and how kind and wonderful he was, because everyone else only saw his outer behaviour, which was immature, irritating, frustrating and overbearing. I never stopped wondering if there was something wrong with him, but each time some event caused me to test this with the doctor, I'd come home $30 or $40 poorer with an answer that usually caused me to feel embarrassed and anxious rather than relieved. There's nothing wrong with your son. We have normal blood tests and I've tested him for every condition I can think of. There is nothing else to rule out. Perhaps you would benefit from a parenting class, or even counselling might help you gain a more balanced outlook. These words were meant to be kind, and I can only believe that they were not meant to sound patronising, but they were of absolutely no help. I did attend parenting classes and I used the techniques quite admirably, I thought. It's not hard to guess the result. These particular parenting practices were based on expressing my feelings at their behaviour. And of course with FASD, it's very difficult for children to understand the feelings of another. The other issue that caused this system to fail dismally for us was that many techniques were based on abstract concepts. Of course, it didn't work the way I'd been told it would. I gave up. Although it was less effective to yell, I continued to use that particular parenting technique because it made me feel better than saying, Seth, when you crack all the eggs and put them in the toaster, it upsets me because. It was so much more satisfying to yell. And I think it's important that the parenting techniques, most of the anything from Triple P or anything, any parenting classes are going to be based on having a neurotypical child. A child with FASD is not neurotypical. Anyway, that's half that chapter. I'll read the next half in the next video. Thank you very much.